Hello and welcome again to Microeconomics. Today we're going to continue our discussion of various different industrial types. Last time we talked about the most interesting, kind of the foundation form of industry type, which was perfect competition. Actually, perfect competition is fairly rarely occurring form for government, for industry to take in terms of the way they're organized. But it's interesting from the standpoint of the theory of it, because the theory of it actually shows us exactly how efficient an industry can be and how good things can be for society as a whole. Today we're going to go all the way to the other continuum. To kind of remind you, when we talked about perfect competition, we were talking about competition in which there were lots and lots of firms and lots of buyers. Today we're going to talk about perfect monopoly, and monopoly is the other end of the continuum. Monopoly occurs when we have a single producer of a good or a substitute for which there are no easy substitutes. The good or service is unique, and there's a unique producer of this one and only good or service. So let's look at the characteristics of perfect monopoly industry. They're the sole supplier of a product. There are no close substitutes, and we'll see in the next section that in fact eventually kind of goes away. And probably the most important characteristic from our standpoint is that there are barriers to entry. Now, barriers to entry mean that it's impossible for other firms to come into the industry, and so we won't have the sort of in-migration, out-migration that we had when we were talking about perfect competition. Now, barriers to entry can take one of three different forms. The first one is the most common form, and the second one is less common, and the third one's even less common. So first off, legal restrictions. Oftentimes, monopolies exist because they have a patent or some sort of an invention, some sort of an exclusive right to a particular product that no one else is allowed to produce. This is granted by government. They're typically granted in order to incentivize or cause people to want to produce new products. And so they're given an exclusive right. You could think here as an example of pharmaceuticals, in which once the medicine is produced, they have an exclusive right to a period of time in which no one can copy it. Another sort of restriction is a restriction based on a federal license or a state license. There are industries in which the federal government licenses them to produce a particular product, and no one else is allowed to do this. A great example of this would be certain kinds of weapon systems in which the embedded technology is so unique or so unusual that they're the only ones that are allowed to even have access to it. Also, we have some businesses which have some sort of a state license. An example here would be in alcohol, in the alcohol industry. In alcohol industry, there are only certain people who are allowed to sell alcoholic beverages, to be distributors and that sort of thing, and that's a state licensure. This is the most frequently occurring way to have a perfect monopoly firm. The second most frequently occurring way is what is known as a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly occurs when we have a very steep downward sloping long run average cost curve. And so what that essentially means is as we produce more and more of the good or service, it gets less and less expensive. And so here's an example of it. So here we have a really steep long-run average cost curve. If we go from producing a very small number of units to producing more units, the cost drops very quickly. Now, if the market is sufficiently small, then it doesn't make any sense to have multiple organizations producing the exact same product, because it would be a very expensive proposition. This is the argument that's often given for utilities as an example. It really doesn't make sense to have multiple companies who are, 2 or 3 companies, all of which are bringing electrical service to a particular neighborhood, because the cost of the additional wires and the distribution system and the poles and all that sort of thing would be prohibitively expensive. And so this one almost exists because of the theory itself. And lastly, and this is a fairly unusual one today, although historically it's a fairly normal one, some barriers to entry are due to control of an essential resource. It was the case many years ago that Alcoa had almost exclusive access to aluminum. Professional sports leagues have almost exclusive access to the sports talent. And the example that we're going to use several different times is De Beers Consolidated Mines. At one time, De Beers was a monopoly because they had almost all of the diamonds that were known in the world. Now, it's going to turn out that that actually ended, but makes a great example anyway. So who is De Beers? De Beers actually started in 1866 in South Africa. It was the discovery of above ground actual diamonds. Diamonds were discovered that were actually above ground. Today, De Beers actually mines deep underground because they've actually followed that seam down 2 or 3 miles downward. At one time, they controlled the world supply of uncut diamonds. During the Great Depression, diamond prices fell off drastically. De Beers was already so well established that they began kind of a two-pronged attack in order to control what was going on in that market. The first prong of it was marketing. They sought to increase consumer demand, and what they essentially did was to build demand by convincing people that they were great investments, that they were family heirlooms, and they lasted forever, and it was one of the best ways that you could possibly use to show your attraction, your love, or whatever for the other members of your family. They also decided to control on the supply side by setting a standard where they only recognized certain buyers who were the wholesalers, sold them only boxes of uncut diamonds. Each and every box was exactly the same size, and they established the price, and you had no choice. You could buy it, you could take it or leave it, but otherwise you could not. There was no negotiation whatsoever. Now, if De Beers was a U.S. firm, that would be in violation of antitrust laws, and so they would be sued as a result of that. But since they're an international firm, U.S. law doesn't really have a whole lot of control over them. What does have control over them, however, is the forces of economics. And by the mid-1990s, they had lost control of the market, primarily because diamonds had been discovered in other parts of the world. Russia is today the largest producer of diamonds, not South Africa. There's also been substantial finds in Australia and in northern Canada as well. But probably what did more to harm them than anything else was the introduction of reliable synthetic diamonds. Diamonds are oftentimes used in tools and for things other than just for ornamentation, and the synthetic diamonds have turned out to be easily as good as the ornamental diamonds for that usage. So in the mid-1980s, De Beers controlled 90% of the market. By 2007, they only control 45% of the market, and in fact, even less today. And so they have been forced through a series of lawsuits and so forth to begin to open up the practice and actually negotiate for prices and to a certain extent comply with the U.S. antitrust laws, primarily because we purchase roughly 50% of the total of the diamonds that are purchased throughout the world. Now, monopolies can exist. What we've been talking about is an international monopoly, and that's probably the rarest form. But monopolies can actually exist on a local basis, on a national basis, or on an international basis. On a local basis, if you live in a small town and you're the only grocery store in a small town, then you have a local monopoly. And so you have, as we will see, a considerable control over the status of competition, and more importantly for you as the monopolist, control over price. It's also possible to have a national monopoly. There are laws against national monopolies, But there are cases in which we actually try to keep a monopoly but control the behavior of the monopoly, as we'll see when we get to the antitrust and regulation section. There's also such thing as an international monopoly. De Beers originally had an international monopoly, but of course lost it through the forces of time. There are a number of other areas in which people have attempted to form and control monopolies, and if you do that through an organization that's known as a cartel, and OPEC is an example of an international cartel. Monopolies are really not very long-lasting. They're actually fairly rare, because what happens ultimately is some sort of a product which is a ready substitute eventually will develop and substitute for the monopoly, especially if you're a very abusive monopoly. And that economic profit attracts competitors, and they don't necessarily have to make exactly the same product, just something that will substitute. And a good example of that's in the diamond industry, where synthetic diamonds are not as pretty as organic diamonds, but nevertheless they do serve the purpose of making cutting tools and that sort of thing, and so ultimately they were a substitute, a new product, but a product that does the same thing. Now, since monopoly supplies the entire market demand, they face a downward sloping demand curve. I want to remind you that when we were talking about the perfect competitor, since they were such a small portion of the market, faced a flat demand curve, that is a horizontal demand curve. They could sell as many as they wanted at whatever the ongoing price was, because they were overall a very small portion of the overall market. In the case of a monopolist, since he supplies the entire market, he doesn't look at one little spot on the demand curve. He looks at the entire demand curve. Since it's downward sloping, that means that if he sells more units, if he sells more of his product, then he has to lower the price, and he lowers the price not only on the additional product, but on all the units that were sold before that. So his average revenue is equal to the total revenue divided by the quantity that he sells. In this case, since he's selling the previous units at lower prices, that means that his marginal revenue will actually fall more quickly. In our case, in the case where we were looking at perfect competition, we said that marginal revenue is equal to average revenue is equal to price. In the case of a monopolist, his price is equal to his average revenue, but his marginal revenue is different. So let's see how that works. Suppose we find ourselves initially selling 3 boxes of uncut diamonds for $7,000, and we decide we want to increase our sales by 1 additional box per day. In order to do that, since we face a downward sloping demand curve, we have to lower our price. So we have to lower our price from $7,000 to $6,750, which means we're going to gain an additional $6,750 in revenue. That's the additional unit of sales that we had, going from 3 to 4 times the amount that we sold it for, which was $6,750. But remember that if we had stuck with the 3 units of sales, we would have gotten $7,000 for those, so we're actually losing $750 worth of revenue, because we had 3 units that we would have sold for $7,000, but we're now selling them for $6,750. That is, we're selling them for $250 less. Since there were 3 boxes of those at $250 less, that's a total of $750. So the gain is actually only $6,000. And remember, that is called marginal revenue. It is the gain, the change in total revenue from 1 additional unit of sales. And though we sold that last unit for $6,750, we actually only picked up $6,000. The reason being we lost $750 on the first 3 units. So again, it's important to notice that marginal revenue falls more quickly than average revenue or price. So here the marginal revenue of $6,000 is less than the price of $6,750. So if we put our marginal revenue curve on this graph, we'll see that it's actually below the average revenue or demand curve, and so declines more quickly. So the marginal revenue declines more quickly than average revenue, and the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping, and in fact it has twice the slope of the average revenue curve. So if we looked at what would happen throughout the entire demand curve, what we would see is that it would peak at a point and then come down from that point. So here we have the actual numbers in which we've looked at various different scenarios moving along our demand curve, and we're going anywhere from selling 0 boxes of diamonds to selling 17 boxes of diamonds. And you can see the various different prices associated with that. So if we sell 1 box, we sell it for $7,500. If we sell 2 boxes, we sell them for $7,250. Column 3 is the total revenue. We simply multiply column 1 times column 2, and we get column 3. And then in column 4, we see our marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue for a 1 unit change. Now, since these are all 1 unit changes, we can just simply take the difference. So if we go from selling 1 box to selling 2 boxes, we go from $7,500 total revenue to $14,500 total revenue, so we pick up an additional $7,000 of total revenue. If we go from 2 boxes to 3 boxes, we go from $14,500 of total revenue to $21,000 of total revenue, so we pick up an additional $6,500. Notice that that number goes down, 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 and then in fact at 16 it actually is 0, and then at 17 it turns negative. What that tells us is that when we go from 15 boxes to 16 boxes, the total revenue doesn't change any at all. We sell an additional box, but we lose so much on the original 15 boxes that it overcomes that, and so the marginal revenue goes to 0. And then in fact, if we go on to 17, we actually have a negative marginal revenue. Now I want to remind you of some concepts that we talked about before. Remember, we talked about before elastic, inelastic, and unit elastic portions of the demand curve. And if you look at the numbers here, reminder that when the price is elastic, as the price falls, the marginal revenue is greater than 0, or total revenue increases. If you'll remember back to the chapter on elasticity, when we raised price, total revenue fell, and when we lowered price, total revenue increased in the elastic section. Then we get to the unit elastic section, and then going beyond unit elastic section, we get to the inelastic section. And remember that in the inelastic section, as price falls, total revenue falls, and as price increases, total revenue increases. So if you look then at what's happening to total revenue in the bottom graph, you see that total revenue is actually maximized at the unit elastic portion, and then begins to go down after that. So one way of thinking of this is a monopolist would never operate in the inelastic portion of his demand curve, because in the inelastic portion of his demand curve, if he increased price, it would increase his total revenue and it would decrease his cost. So he would never operate down in that section because it wouldn't be profit maximizing. I'll say that again. In the inelastic portion, if he increases his price, that increases, let's use the business term, his sales figure. And since he's selling less quantity, it would decrease his cost figure. So he would never operate in that section down there. And the reason he would never operate down there is because he could make more money at any other place. And another way of looking at it is if you'll look, you can see that the marginal revenue curve actually hits 0 at the unit elastic portion. So the marginal revenue curve is actually negative down there. There is no cost figure where marginal revenue of negative amount would match marginal cost. And so we know for sure we're not going to be operating in that section. So you can see from this graph, we're not sure what level you're going to produce at, but it's certainly going to be some level below 16 units, which makes sense given the numbers that we just saw in our schedule. Now, reminder, and this is basically what we just said. Reminder, the monopolist is actually going to choose his own price, which will dictate a quantity, or vice versa. He could think in terms of, I'm going to produce a certain quantity, which will tell me what my price is. He is a price maker. Our perfectly competitive firm was a price taker. That is, he just takes whatever price is given to him. And he's going to profit maximize in the same sense that we profit maximized before. He's going to be looking for the maximum profit, which is the maximum difference between total revenue and total cost. And that, just as was the case before, is going to be at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So he's looking for that point where he makes his maximum profit. Hopefully he makes a profit. Doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So now we've added on the cost figures for our diamond manufacturer as well. And you see the total cost is in column 5. The marginal cost is in column 6, where marginal cost is just the change in total cost per 1 unit quantity change. In this case, we're looking at single unit jumps in boxes per day, so we can just take the differences. And you see in bold print there the quantity of 10. At a quantity of 10, his total revenues are 52,500. His total costs are 40,000, and so his total profit is 12,500. Reminder once again that is economic profit. The normal profit is already included in the total cost portion because it's an implicit cost and we always include it. That is as close to where marginal revenue equals marginal cost as we can get. And notice points beyond that, it begins to go down again and it begins to turn negative again. You'll notice that in quantities below 4 and below, we're actually losing money, and in quantities 14 and above, we're actually losing money. Looking at it from a graphical standpoint, we've kind of flipped on you this time because we put the totals at the bottom. Let's look at the bottom one first. If you look at the bottom one, what we're looking for is the maximum difference between the blue line and the red line. And remember, the blue line goes up and then back down because we maximize our revenues at the unit elastic portion, which is at quantity of 16. And so we're looking for the widest gap, and the widest gap occurs at 10. Notice that the red line crosses the blue line. That must be at the quantity of 4. And then it crosses it again. That quantity must be 16, 15, 16, somewhere in that neighborhood. The more familiar graph to us is the one at the top, which is the per unit one. And notice now that a couple of things have changed from our perfect competition model. In the perfect competition model, the line that we have in blue here was only one line. That is, we had marginal revenue equals average revenue equals demand because we sold each and every unit for exactly the same price, and it was also horizontal. which is not the case now. Because remember, the monopolist is actually looking at the entire demand curve. So now we have a demand curve in there, which actually is downward sloping. And notice that the marginal revenue curve drops more quickly. Because remember, when we started calculating, we found that the revenue that we generate is offset somewhat by the cost reductions or the price reductions that we have to give on previous units. So now we're looking for the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That is marked as point E. You see the marginal cost curve is the lighter kind of pinkish red, and it intersects marginal revenue at a quantity of 10, which is point E. We go from that up to the average revenue or demand curve at point A, and that tells us what price should be. In this case, price should be $5,250. Our cost at that quantity is point B, which is $4,000. And so the difference between those two, or the $1,250, is how much we make per unit times the 10 units, which is $12,500. And so we see that the little blue shaded area is actually an economic profit. So that entire area is an economic profit. Again, the drawing has gotten a little bit harder to figure out now because number one, we have two blue lines now. That is, we have both an average revenue or demand curve, and we also have a marginal revenue. As we're considering increasing output levels, we have to consider two things: not only what the additional one will sell for, but how much we'll lose on the earlier ones that we were going to sell at a higher price. They also are downward sloping now, but the same principles apply. We're still looking for the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Then we have to go to the demand curve to see what price is available at that, and we have to go to the cost curve to see what the costs are at that point. Now, this would be the typical solution for a monopolist, that is, to be making an economic profit. Especially in the United States, it doesn't make sense to be a monopolist if there's not an economic profit, because you find yourself under Justice Department scrutiny and so forth. However, it's entirely possible that we could have all the same sorts of possibilities that we had under pure competition. If price is greater than average total cost, which is the one that we were just looking at, you make an economic profit. On the other hand, if average total cost is greater than price, but price is greater than average variable cost, then you would be loss minimizing. That is, you would be incurring an economic loss, and in the short run you would produce in hopes that things would improve. On the other hand, if price is lower than average variable cost, then that's a shutdown point, and we would want to stop production. Here's the case in which we're actually loss minimizing. In this case, our optimum point is a point where it's still marked as E. It's a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The price at that point is B, which is below A, which tells us that in fact we're incurring a loss on a per unit basis, and the loss is by the difference between A and B, and so the whole area that you see in pink in this one is in fact actually a loss. This is an unlikely situation, and it's certainly not a situation that you would stay with for a long period of time. However, it is a loss minimization for a monopolist. A monopolist obviously wouldn't stay in this position for a terribly long period of time, just as was the case in perfect competition. Well, we've talked about the short run. We're going to stop here, and next time we'll talk about what happens in the long run and some other rather unusual situations for a monopolist. We'll see you all again next time.